Today we're talking about what is in my opinion one of the most overlooked items in Season 4. Witchblade. Witchblade is kind of a niche item due to the stats it provides, but I feel like it's hardly picked up on characters who can make really good use of it. Witchblade costs 2050 gold, has 15% attack speed, 10% movement speed, 200 health, and 2 passives. One passive is an aura that reduces attack speed of enemies around you by 20%. The other passive is anti-heal basically. Whenever you hit an enemy, the healing is reduced by 15%, stacking up to 3 times or 45% and lasting 5 seconds. That's a decent mix of stats for some characters, but on others they don't synergize too well, and that's probably why many people kind of forget about this item, because it's not in the typical build for example hunters, simply because it doesn't really provide the stats a hunter wants. Well, let's look at this item in comparison to others so we learn a little bit more about it. I've made a small table here where you can see various attack speed items. I've excluded these attack speed items that are typically very much core and have really high damage. I've excluded, for example, Kin Size, because that's just basically core if you're going for a non-crit build and you're looking for DPS with attack speed. I've excluded Executioner because it's pretty much always needed. And I've excluded Relic Dagger because it's basically just words when it comes to the stats. But I've included the rest of the attack speed items, set of boots that are somewhat, well, logical to be used in combination with other attack speed items. So we have Witchblade, Winged Blade, Ekival, Hasten Fatalis, Asi, and the Crusher. And if you look at the numbers here, I'm not going to go through all of them, but what you will see is that Witchblade with 15% attack speed is pretty much somewhere in the middle. You have the exception of Ekival and Silverbranch here, or up to 30%, but most others sit like between 10 and 20% attack speed, and Witchblade fits right in there. Due to the attack speed increase alone, Witchblade gives you a decent chunk of extra DPS. Like I said, nothing crazy, the attack speed boot alone have more attack speed than that, but it's still a solid amount. Next stat is health. Most attack speed items don't have health, the exceptions here being Witchblade, Winged Blade, and Relic Dagger. Like I said, Relic Dagger is kind of worse in any regard, unless you're looking for some mix of attack speed, cooldown reduction, and relic increase, which is more of a support thing and not really a basic attacker thing. So in this regard, we only really have Wingblade to compare to. Wingblade gives you 300 health, Witchblade gives you 200 health. It's a difference. Wingblade is better in that regard. If you're looking to go as safe and tanky as you possibly can, then Wingblade is probably the better choice, simply because of the slow immunity in addition to more health. But Witchblade still provides you with a decent amount of health, which will obviously also help in a direct trade. It's 200 more health that the enemy has to chunk down from you. The next stat is movement speed. Now, movement speed is an interesting stat because you can never really quantify it in terms of DPS or something like that. But movement speed in Smite is really important. Juking is really important. It's a lot more important than other MOBAs, in my opinion, simply due to the fact that the attacks have to be landed on the target, and movement speed makes that harder to do. As such, I think a very valuable stat. We have 3 items here that do offer this stat, and they kind of have different purposes. Once again, Wingblade, a purely defensive choice, so not really playing in the same league here. Hasten Fatalis, mostly bought because of the passive attack speed and pen. The movement speed is more of a bonus here to facilitate the passive, whereas Witchblade is the only one where it's more of an aggressive bonus for the item in addition to the other stats it had, and not so much working like with Fatalis or with Wingblade. In that regard, it used to be very strong in Season 1 because it offered that movement speed. Completely different stats on the item back then, but it was very highly valued also because of its movement speed. And that is back now, and many people did not really notice that so far. That opens up a lot of options that people haven't really realized. It especially makes Witchblade more interesting for melee AA characters, for example Osiris or Kali, which usually make use of a little more movement speed in addition to what their kit provides them with and what the standard items in their build provide them with. That's also a reason why the whole tree with Heartseeker and Stonecutting Sword and so on is, well, gaining a lot more recognition lately, because it just seems to function very well in that regard as well. In some other regards, the item is obviously lacking a little bit. It has no power, it has no penetration, no lifesteal, and no crowd control reduction if you're looking for that. But most of those stats are mostly found on items that are purely built for higher aggression, higher damage. For example, such as Ekival or Asi. Those items really fill another niche than Witchblade would. And Witchblade, on top of that, has a pretty great passive. Or two passives rather. Like I already pointed out, there's the anti-heal and there is the attack speed reduction. And the combination of the two is what I feel is, well, vastly underrated by many, simply because you don't really see the connection directly between the two. One is anti-heal, one is attack speed reduction. What do they have to do with each other? But we get into that. First, I'd like to just put the anti-heal on its own into perspective. We have certain anti-heal items in the game now, quite a few different ones. We have a set of Witchblade, Brawler's Beatstick, Divine Ruin, Pestilence, Cursed Ankh, and the Upgrade Cursed Ankh. If we look at the raw values here, Beatstick comes in with 40% healing reduction, Divine Ruin 40%, Pestilence 25%, Cursed Ankh 50%, and Cursed Ankh Upgrade 65%. So all of these provide different stats going up from 40%. Those with 40% last 8 seconds, while the Cursed Ankh lasts 10 seconds and upgraded even 15 seconds. Witchblade is a lot shorter. Witchblade is only 5 seconds, but it goes up to 45%. It's not the ideal anti-heal item. If you're just looking for straight up anti-heal, then you're probably getting a better use out of Brawler's Beatstick because you can basically lower the healing from the start. If an enemy realizes they're gonna get hit with Witchblade, they might just try and heal up after they only had one stack on them. And you have to stay closer to the enemies for it to work. But for certain guards, that's just very simple. And if you have a guard that already has a lot of attack speed, it will be very easy to reapply. And as long as you have means of sticking to the target, you will have options to make use of that passive to a very decent extent. And many people will just not really realize what's happening to them because it's not the kind of anti-heal item they're expecting, at least for now. In regards to the anti-heal value, it still has the highest value aside of Cursed Ankh and the Upgrade Cursed Ankh when the stacks are full. Which obviously takes a while, but when it happens, then it's still the best anti-item in the game. But in general, I would say it's rather not. It's more of a situational additional anti-heal. But we need to understand what this means in combination with the anti-attack speed. Think of Freya and think of ADCs in general with their lifesteal. Witchblade's anti-heal does not only apply to healing, it also applies to lifesteal. It also applies to the effect of the new Shaman's Ring or the new Soul Eater. So really it pretty much works against a lot of things. And we have a lot of different types of healing that have been introduced into the game in new ways. For example, there's a Bracer of Undoing as well. And like I said, there are the new rings or the new Soul Eater. There are various ways in which characters can heal now which weren't there before. And healers are still, for the majority, considered rather strong. And as such, the effect of Witchblade is just very, very good because it, while not necessarily being a purely anti-heal focused item, allows you to, well, counter various options of the enemies restoring health. And in a direct trade with an ADC, the difference is pretty huge. I'll just show you the values of Freya here, where she heals up with no effect on her, just the anti-attack speed effect from Witchblade, which applies in an aura, which gives a total value of over 100 healing, more closer to 150 actually. And then we have the same with the anti-heal from Witchblade applied. And all of a sudden those values look a lot lower. We're around 70 healing here in total, because every healing effect that she receives is reduced. So in the end, while she would have healed to nearly full beforehand, after the application of Witchblade, she maybe heals back to half from very low health. So in essence, not only does Witchblade counter attack speed characters like hunters in regards to their attack speed itself, but also their lifesteal. So while not every hunter is building lifesteal at the moment, when they do, Witchblade does a lot against them. The question with Witchblade is always going to be which characters should pick it up, but I see quite a few that have potential for it. The ones I've enjoyed the most so far are Kali and Osiris, simply because Kali has this one flex slot that was often taken up by Winged Blade. But if you don't need Winged Blade, then I feel like Witchblade is a very good option. It also really allows you to trade better in certain situations. If you are against a heavy trading focused comp, then that works very well. Or the other one being Osiris, who just very well works with another additional effect that counters the enemy's damage in combination with a 3, for example, and who can make use of these mix items, hybrid items between attack speed and health and stuff like that. So really good for him. There are others that can make use of it, for example Bakasura as well. I would not generally recommend it too much on hunters because they may not make as much use of the other stats on the item. Like I said, they would rather look for more damage oriented items, more well, flex stuff like Hasten Fatalis. not so much a pure defense stat like health on an item, but there are others. Like, for example, you could also consider Erlang Shen for it, you could consider Bellona, you could consider maybe even Raven if you're looking for an attack speed build. Very rare these days, but any warrior that makes use of attack speed and certain assassins really. Who, on the other hand, makes less use of the item now, in my opinion, are Guardians, simply because you will not be able to keep up that passive most of the time. You have to hit the enemy at a very frequent rate, meaning you have to be in their face and punching them, and that's not what most Guardians do best. They CC enemies out, but they are not necessarily the ones who apply enough AAs for the passive to be worth it, unless you're just looking for the attack speed reduction part of it. To close this one out, I would quickly like to talk about the movement speed. The movement speed soft cap is 457, which means that afterwards every movement speed item you get every movement speed stat is reduced by 20%. The hard cap is 540.5. After that, every movement speed item is reduced by 50%, and at that point it's usually not worth getting that much movement speed anymore. I have realized that depending on the build with Kali, I actually went over that cap, so this is one of the few occasions where you can actually consider ditching your boots. If you have Witchblade and you need some sort of situational item, then you could consider getting an other 10% movement speed item instead, and getting out your boots, and you should still be fine, especially if you have like a combination of Hasten Fatalis, Stone Cutting Sword, and Witchblade. You can often just consider getting rid of the boots as much as movement speed in general is worth. The point where you get over the cap means you usually should be looking for something else because it's not worth as much anymore. With that, I hope this helped you consider Witchblade for your builds, gave you a bit more of an overview of the item. Some of you may have already been using it, some of you may consider it a little more now. Let's find out. Thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you for the next one tomorrow. If you're not subbed yet, feel free to click that sub button and maybe the bell as well. It really helps me out. Duke Sloth, out.